Now I think we're live and I can hear myself. So, well, welcome to this session. And this is the first in-person session that I've done since the pandemic. So it's really lovely to be in a room with so many people. And I'll give you a brief introduction to our speakers, and we'll be discussing beyond APCs and BPCs, so article processing and book processing charges. Unfortunately, one of our colleagues, Elizabeth Hurren, couldn't be with us today. So we've changed it slightly. So as well as having Joe and Meg, you're also going to hear from me about starting a Diamond Open Access Journal. So just a quick overview. Welcome to our speakers. Joe is a senior lecturer based in the Department of Organisation, Work and Technology and the Department of Sociology. And his research interests include open access, and he's part of the Open Book Collective and can talk very knowledgeably about that. He's based at the University of, it's Lancaster. Yeah, I was just thinking from my head, I was thinking Lancaster, Leicester. And my colleague Meg, who works at the Haddon and holds a PhD in e-research and technology enhanced learning, also from Lancaster, and an MA in cultural anthropology, and is also a qualified librarian. And Meg is the managing editor of the Journal of Information Literacy and on the advisory board of Studies in Technology Enhanced Learning. So over to Joe.
Yeah, so this is the sort of Lancaster Cambridge shaker, because also in the audience we have Rupert Gatty, who's from Cambridge and has also been heavily involved in the establishment of Open Book Collective, some of the other things on that screen. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I was really interested to hear some of the discussions in the previous panel, and I was just chatting to someone else, and I was sort of itching to answer that question about how do we fund all this? And I suppose that is the question that has been animating what I and my colleagues have been doing on this project. The COPIN project has been sort of cut off down here, which stands for Community-Led Open Publication Infrastructures for Monographs. This is a project funded by Research England and the Arcadia Fund. Produced a range of different outputs. It's been a fascinating, really inspiring project to work on. We're coming towards the end now. Opening the Future, that's a revenue model for university presses. TOTE, which is an open metadata management system. I don't have time to talk about those. I'm very happy to answer any questions about them if that's of interest. But yeah, I'm instead going to be talking about the Open Book Collective and the challenge perhaps of what I call processing open access books. I guess maybe the mouse does not work actually. Let's see now. Yeah, it does work. Yes. Okay, so we've heard a lot about APCs and BPCs, and I just wanted to sort of relay out perhaps the case against book processing charges as I would see it. So they're expensive. We've heard about that already. £10,000 to £11,000 for large commercial presses, but even for smaller not-for-profit presses, £4,500 to £6,000 is not, atypical. And just from full disclosure, I'm also involved, again, cut off. That says Mattering down there, a small, very tiny open access book publisher. We don't call them BPCs, but we do say if an author has funding available to support publication work, then we will happily accept that. And that ranges between, well, £0 and £6,000 actually. But of course, that is prohibitively expensive. We don't make it a requirement, I should be absolutely clear. And we're not comfortable with it. That's in a way, that's something that animated our whole involvement in this project. We do it because we have to survive. We do need to pay the people that we need to pay, but we're not happy about it. You've also heard about this already. Unequal, in a sort of local context. Researchers on large grants more likely to be able to have access to funds to support BPCs. Again, as we heard about in the previous panel, likely to be accessible to later career scholars, and also likely to be only affordable by academics in wealthier national contexts, even if there is a discount offered by a publisher. But I particularly wanted to actually think about this, which you haven't really heard so much about. I think BPCs and APCs are a model which is stultifying. We've already struggled perhaps to think outside that system. And we've been thinking, okay, where's money going to come from for APCs and BPCs? I think that is starting with that question is the wrong question. We need to think differently. The problem is that this kind of, as it says at the bottom there, it's a failure of imagination. It's a failure of collective imagination of the scholarly community. And that's not about blaming any individual. There's lots of amazing ideas about how to do open access differently. Part of the problem is often the funds haven't really been available to build and to think about some of those ideas. On our project, we are very fortunate to have had some of those funds. which has been really exciting to be involved with. Entrenches commercial publishing monopolies, and yeah, entrenches a thin version of open access, where open access is seen as something that's a benefit. Oh, you can tick the box and you pay your BPC, you get the benefit of those citations, but no, it's not something we think is necessary for publishing. I would obviously disagree. But there is, I'd say, this is just something I thought about in preparing this talk. There is actually something I want to save from book processing charges, and it's not the charge. It's actually the processing bit of the book processing charge. So we can get rid of the charge, but in actual fact, maybe there is something in processing. So I'm a sociologist. I dabble sometimes with something called process philosophy, but also science and technology studies, interested in how things are composed through relations. And I think books are composed through relations. But this would then mean thinking about processing, not as about the transformation of a scholarly work into a product, but actually rather thinking about the diverse relations that books both put into play, because they do, but also that they depend upon. In the project, other things that we've been doing to explore some of these ideas, this is a little bit tangential, but I think it's important to highlight, is exploring how that might work in relation to thinking in a more open way about what an academic book is. So experimental publishing. My colleagues, Janneke Adema, who is the PI on the project, and other colleagues have been exploring that in some really, really fascinating ways. Haven't got time to talk about that today, but you get a sense of what they're interested in, exploring books contain multitudes. They are not defined. They instantiate relations, which in really interesting ways. And Janneke has written a lot about this in her work. Please do check it out if you're interested. So processing books, I think, is an interesting place to think about and an interesting place to start thinking about more. I actually also, as I sort of trailed in my comment in the previous section, I'm particularly interested in a particular way of processing, and that's what I call infrastructuring. So one thing I don't think we've really talked about, it's been there in some of the conversations that we've had, is about the infrastructures of scholarly knowledge dissemination. These are so fundamental. We want to rethink how we do publishing. Those infrastructures are absolutely fundamental. And that means, in terms of open access, the infrastructures that are necessary for the dissemination of open access books, thinking of understanding that they themselves are situated interventions, putting new relations into play. I was just talking with Meg, our co-panelist, something we're both really interested in, and you know, recognise infrastructures are not neutral. There's a micropolitics. I could tell you some stories about the micropolitics of the Open Book Collective. I hope to write about it one day, but I'll have to get the permission of my colleagues before I go ahead and publish that. But it was you know, interesting. It's an interesting work. We see a range of open infrastructures at the moment that are really experimenting in fascinating ways with what publishing might mean. PubPub, what else we have? We have the Jupiter Book Initiative, things that explore the possibilities of writing and collaborating and publishing in really interesting new ways. That's about content. But what I'm actually talking about is an infrastructure which is not about content. It's, at least in part, but certainly not totally, about revenue, about money. That's been, as I said to comment somebody in the break now, that is the elephant in the room often when it comes to open access. Where the hell is the money going to come from? And I would say, you know, of course, to answer that question of where the money is going to come from, we obviously need to ask the question first: where's that money going at the moment? But so the Open Book Collective is an organisation. It exists in the UK. It's incorporated and will in due course be a UK registered charity. And I'm telling you a little bit about what we've been doing and what we're hoping to do with the Open Book Collective. So these are the aims of the Open Book Collective: to generate new revenue streams for open access book publishers and what we call service providers, infrastructure providers. We think, as I mentioned, the infrastructures of publishing are really important. Support a model of open access book publishing not reliant on BPCs, or certainly not at least as reliant on BPCs. We'll start there. Make it easier for librarians to support open access membership schemes. I'll come back to that in a second. And build a new community of publishers, service providers, and librarians. We think, you know, if we're thinking in a more imaginative ways about thinking, solving or addressing the challenges of publishing, we need reconfigurations in the academic landscapes, and that I think is a really important part of it. The ethos is grounded in a belief that infrastructures need to be open, that organisations need to be not-for-profit. And I think that's why I asked that question before about about the challenge that we've seen so often, the commercialisation of the infrastructures of open access. And it's absolutely vital that I would argue that that doesn't happen, that those are supported and maintained by and controlled by the communities that they serve. So yeah, being community-led. And supporting bibliodiversity. So publishing in different types of publishers, different languages, publishing not just in the global north, but also in the global south. So membership models. So these exist for those librarians in the room. You will know probably about these. These exist in the world at the moment. And what we're doing with the Open Book Collective is building on and extending that model. But for those of you that don't know what that is, so the model is, and so we have two publishers here. This represents Puncton Books and Open Book Publishers that have existing library membership programs. And the way it works is they, as publishers, these are open access publishers, all their content is fully open, go to a library or other supporter and they say, will you financially support us as a publisher, not based on providing access to the content, but based on our track record. There are other initiatives that then do that, and they do this on a contractual basis, right, on an annual basis. Other initiatives doing something similar. The Opening the Future revenue model is something, an output of our project that's doing something similar in relation to university presses, but also infrastructure providers do this. The Directive Open Access Books and OAPEN have a library membership program. And it's been really transformative for many publishers. I know certainly for Puncton Books and for Open Book Publishers, been transformative in what they're able to do and enabling them to move away from such a reliance on book processing charges. Now, we can imagine there are challenges of scaling this model financially, and I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm really happy to answer that question if anyone would like me to talk about it. But there are also bureaucratic challenges. If we imagine that this model was to really expand, librarians would quickly become overwhelmed with different initiatives contacting them, asking them for support, asking them to provide those kind of support. And that's kind of what we are trying to address with the Open Book Collective. So we built a platform. It's not live yet. These are all sort of demo shots. And I'm going to take you straight into the heart of the platform. The color is a bit funny in the screen. It's meant to be a blue, not black. But anyway, and what it allows you to do, this is the kind of key area that a librarian or any other supporter would potentially navigate. And if you imagine me sort of scrolling down the page, you have, I won't move too far from the microphone. You have on the platform individual publishers that are offering library membership programs that a librarian or other supporter can add to a quotation for supporting one or more of these library membership programs. And then the platform also bundles together some of these individual library membership programs into what we call collectives and collections. Puts these different initiatives in one place where the librarian can start to look at them and understand what they're trying to do, see whether they are happy to support everything, which of course we would encourage, or perhaps if they are short of funds, make decisions that are based perhaps on their political, strategic aims or priorities, say, of the students and research faculty. This is actually the front page. So what are the benefits for libraries and institutions? Well, the platform aggregates, acts as a membership package aggregator and discovery portal. Provides quick and consistent information about the values and priorities and subject areas of different publishers. We do due diligence. We think that's really, really important. We scrutinize everybody who wants to be on the platform, and that's a really important process so that librarians, institutions can have confidence that what they're supporting are high quality publication initiatives. Workflow, a very important part of the platform. Single procurement process, integration with third-party payment arrangements. Librarians, for example, in the UK will use JISC for a lot, and we expect to integrate with them. Consolidated contracting processes. And what about for publishers and service providers? So again, workflow, we manage the bureaucratic business of running a library membership program, invoicing, contracting, dealing with payment flows. And what this does, we think, and we know, speaking to publishers, that this is potentially of interest to them. What this does is it makes offering membership programs possible for even the smallest publisher, something that's completely inconceivable before. The main cost of our work is outreach. So doing that work of speaking to libraries about the different initiatives on the platform and the benefits of supporting the publishers on the Open Book Collective. We allow publishers to reduce the amount of BPCs dependent on the new income stream, and also providing new much needed income to the infrastructures of open access book publication and circulation. This is the kind of checkout stream, just giving you shots as we go through. Other key points to highlight: running costs to share between publishers and service providers on the one hand and libraries on the other. There are opportunities for everyone with a financial stake in the Open Book Collective to become involved in governance and control what we do. And also we have this collective fund that we, part of the income that we receive goes to, which anybody can apply to build capacity in relation to open access publishing. All financial information, fees, revenue, and so on is reported openly and transparently. Again, I haven't got time to talk about that in detail, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about that. How am I doing for time? Okay, I'll skip past this page then. Just a last one then. Just kind of like highlight. So this, thinking about this as an experiment in processing and infrastructuring open access book. It's an experiment. It's an experiment in collaboration over competition, establishing those new relations that we think are so important between publishers, infrastructure providers, and libraries, and also, I think, materializing and imagining in a concrete way new infrastructural possibilities. Launching, I think, hopefully in early December. Date to be confirmed. Thank you very much.
Those people not in the room were having a bit of technical shenanigans.
Oh, shit. Yeah. Well,
hey.
Anyway.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Meg Westbury, and I'm the Academic Services Librarian for the Human and Social Sciences here at the Cambridge University Libraries. It's really lovely to see so many of my colleagues in the audience. I'm going to be talking about a publishing model called Diamond Open Access today, and grounding it in my experiences as the managing editor of a journal called the Journal of Information Literacy. And I just want to pose this question at the beginning: is this model kind of a needs must sort of arrangement that people would turn to when slicker or more commercial arrangements, models aren't available to them? Or is it truly a disruptive opportunity that allows great innovation in publishing? And I'll come back to that. So just a really, really brief overview of Diamond Open Access. I promised I would give this at the beginning. It's essentially a model where no financial burden is passed on to either authors or readers. So authors can publish for free, readers can access it for free, and that's it. It's actually a relatively simple definition. And in numbers, Coalition S did a study last year. They reckon between 17,000 and 29,000 Diamond Open Access journals are out there, though they reckon it's an undercount for various reasons. Interestingly, it's 2/3 of the journals listed in the Directory of Open Access Journals. Amazingly, it equals about 8 to 9% of global scholarly output, and that APC open access journals are only at 10 to 11%. So Diamond is actually pretty crucial form of the scholarly publishing landscape. It comprises 44% of all articles in fully OA journals. So here's the deal with them, though. They tend to be relatively small, running on shoestring budgets. They tend to be concentrated in the humanities and social sciences. They serve relatively diverse scholarly niches, which makes them quite interesting. But also just to say that just because they're running on these shoestring budgets, they do offer the full suite of what journals sort of would do. So full on peer review, for example, and other services like copy editing, etc. So why in the world would anybody choose this? Well, I did a little bit of research, a little review of the literature, and there are a few reasons. One of which is an ethical standpoint. You might choose a Diamond OA publishing model because you feel like it's the right thing to do, and it's the best way to get your information in the widest possible way out there. You might have a more activist perspective. So you might be explicitly be rejecting big publishing and want to go your own way and have some more innovative publishing practices. You might be a novice journal. You're a new journal, maybe you're a group of students. It's a low threshold starting point for getting going, but you might want to get more formal or more commercial down the line. And it may be a labor of love. So you may be a group of academics crafting the perfect journal for your disciplinary niche. And then usually it's a combination of some sort of factor. So it's usually a combination of one of these, however. So benefits of Diamond OA, why would you do it? Well, in the words of the head of the European Open Science group, it's equitable, community-driven, and academic-led and owned. So amazing, right? It's something we should be aspiring to. It provides widespread accessibility to research. You get broad editorial control over the direction, over the content and the policies of your journal. You've got quite nimble operations with relatively small and efficient staffing, and you have the ability to innovate. And there's just the satisfaction of making your research as widely accessible as possible. But of course, there are some cold, hard realities with this model as well. There are few supporting resources available. The Coalition S report that I just referenced, on average, they found that these journals run with a budget of less than, on average of 10,000 euros per year. So small. It's quite labor intensive. So the people running the journals sort of do everything. It's academic led, but it's academics running the entire operation of the journal. And I'll discuss that in the context of the journal that I help edit in a moment. So there is infrastructure out there to help. That's open source software like Open Journal System, but it may be only limited in how far it can go, and it takes resources to run. And so you obviously can see some built-in constraints here about scaling and sustaining the journal over time. So let's talk about the Journal of Information Literacy and my experiences of it. So I've been the managing editor of this journal for about 2 years, but it was founded in 2008. So it's been around for about 16 years. It publishes 2 to 3 issues per year, about 8 to 12 articles per issue, and it's a peer-reviewed journal. For those of you who aren't librarians and might be wondering what in the world is information literacy, I just thought I would provide you a little definition, which is, so what is IL? Information literacy, in the words of the librarians professional organization here in the UK called SILIP, is the ability to think critically and make balanced judgments about any information we find and use. It empowers us as citizens to reach and express informed views and engage fully with society. So that's a wonderful aspiration, and believe it or not, you can have a journal on the topic. And there's more than one out there. So that was the focus. Right from the get-go, it was envisioned as a researcher practitioner journal. So it would be grounded in well-designed studies, building on research that came before it, but with an eye to benefiting the practices of people who are working in information fields. It's affiliated with the Information Literacy Group of the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals called SILIP, but it wasn't at the beginning. And I'll explain some of the implications of that in a moment. It's part of information as a maturing discipline. So 25 years ago, nobody really used this term in librarianship, but it has been growing sort of along parallel to the growth of the internet as a way for librarians to continue to but they've always been about helping students and researchers navigate information, and this just gives us a much clearer focus on that activity. So the journal is part of more communication channels in the field. It's part of networks of scholars. It's part of developing modes of inquiry and ethics, things like that. So it's part of IL as a discipline. And it gets pretty good rankings if we're going to look at those stinky ranking systems. Like it actually, like in terms of those numbers, it does pretty well against its competitors. And there, believe it or not, there are competitors. Anyway, so if you are familiar with Open Journal System, you'll see that that's the software infrastructure that we use. Those are just some example articles from our latest issue. At any rate, Jill was envisioned as open right from the very beginning. So it was a group of, just an independent group of librarians in the mid-2000s who got together and thought, we should make a journal. There's really a niche for this in the United Kingdom. Right from the beginning, they referenced the Budapest Open Access Declaration of 2001. So they were very consciously making their work open. At the same time, that was kind of the only option available as well, but it really was a perfect storm of the maturing internet with this ethos of wanting to make it as accessible and widely available as possible. So we use CC by SA licenses. So the author is the license holder. The author grants us permission to print it, but the copyright stays with the author. So we always had the ethical standpoint really woven into our desire to be Diamond, although we didn't even know what the term Diamond Open Access was at the time. Our financial position is ridiculous. We operate with less than £1,000 per year. Talk about a shoestring budget. So the money only comes through royalties, through being indexed through EBSCO databases. So we get about £900 per year from that, and that's it. So I think partly why this journal is so successful has something to do with the social aspects of librarianship. There's sort of an ethos of volunteerism and sharing within librarianship that when called to act, when called to duty, they will volunteer, and they put a lot of work into activities that don't have a lot of financial gain behind them, but which help propel the profession forward. And this, in many ways, is what is the sustaining engine of this journal. So operationally, we're hosted on Open Journal System, an open access journal management system that's run by the Public Knowledge Project in Canada through Loughborough University through 2008. So they were hosting us for free. About 2 years ago, they stopped upgrading us, and a lot of other sort of issues happened, and we saw the writing on the wall, and we figured we're going to have to move. So we started looking at other options. So at the end of this year, we're moving to Edinburgh Diamond. So this is a publishing outfit through the University of Edinburgh, publishing scholar-led journals, but they provide some of the infrastructure and the technical support for us. We have your usual complement of journal folks, editorial board, editor-in-chief, managing editor, production editors, book review editors. We have a statistician slash bibliometrician who basically gathers data about our impact. And we have a digital comms officer who promotes us on Twitter. And I learned just this morning on Mastodon. And we have several copy editors, none of whom are paid. So to be clear, no one's gaining a lot from this work in terms of money. And we do it all, the peer review management, the metadata, registering ISBNs, DOIs, all the copy editing, typesetting, analytics, promotion, social media. We do it all. As I said, most of the money comes through database royalties. They're starting in 2000, so just starting this year, 16 years after we were formed, we're starting to receive funds finally through our professional organization. But it's taken that long. It's taken that long to be recognized as an integral part of discussions in the information studies field here. Finally, and as a post-pandemic, as coffers are growing again through conferences and things like that, we're finally going to get a little bit of money through our professional organization. So benefits, well, obviously, there's huge flexibility in being able to chart our direction editorially. We have special issues. We can innovate. We've really examined prejudice and bias in our publishing practices and have tried to change some of our policies. We've made more inclusive language, removal of ableist language. We've had a mentoring scheme for new scholars. We've experimented with open peer review. We explicitly recognize who's done the copy editing now in every single journal, so they're recognized, as well as our peer reviewers. So we absolutely have a long way to go in terms of what we want for this journal, but we really couldn't get there with the nimbleness really that the Diamond model affords us. But the drawbacks, there's a huge amount of volunteer time that goes into running the journal, and it really requires the commitment and the sustained and collective activity of a lot of people and their goodwill. There's the struggle to be seen as a real journal. We're indexed by Scopus, but not by Web of Science. So Web of Science has an amazingly high bar in terms of who they will index. And if you don't have exactly the right policies, you haven't published long enough, you haven't looked at them correctly, it's baffling why we haven't gotten it, but we're working on it. We're chipping away at it. And archiving is just a precarious issue that we're constantly, I thought we were archiving, we were all archived. I came on board as the editor. I found out we're not, and I was horrified, and then instantly tried to get that in line. So it was just some shockingly precarious sort of practices. At any rate, just to summarize, Jill, the Journal of Information Literacy, sees similar pros and cons as Diamond Open Access. It's been a huge learning experience for us. So it obviously makes us better information professionals. And so in many ways, that's why we do it. And it's great to see the journal become more influential over time. Obviously, the goodwill of volunteers is an extremely risky model for sustainability. So I'll offer some ideas in a moment about how it can be a little stronger. Am I doing? Okay, perfect. Okay. I was super excited for our move to Edinburgh Diamond. So just looking ahead, why in the world would we choose this given all the issues? Well, I mean, we talked about some of the many motivating factors. It is an ethical decision for us, and it's a labor of love. So it's obviously, it's a combination of a lot of things. I do want to question the word diamond as a descriptive term, because it implies something highly aspirational, slightly glamorous. And it's not. And also the other terms that we use, like gold and green, they're about what you do with your manuscript after it's done, whereas diamond is about the entire means of production. And so we might just want to rethink the term a little bit. And I think it also offers a critical lens into how the sausage is made, essentially. So it offers a critical lens into the marginalized labor in some ways that goes into making these journals. And I'm actually really thankful to my colleague Sam Moore actually for writing a blog article on this over the summer that inspired those particular comments. But I do think Diamond can be a critical lens into how knowledge is produced, really. So just finally looking ahead, I do think that Diamond is absolutely an ideal worth striving for. The equitable, community-driven, academic-led, that is all extremely worthy. So we need to talk about building capacity really in this area. And how do we become more efficient, more visible? How do we make better standards? How do we make it scalable and sustainable? There are other funding models that we've talked about at the journal all the time. So it's sponsorship, donations, crowdfunding, advertising, freemium models, you name it. None of which has seemed particularly palatable. So it's just, we're continuing to talk about it. But at the end of the day, my personal feeling is that more university/library-based publishing initiatives for helping scholars get their journals going, particularly reaching out to emerging subdisciplines, is a really, really strong and positive way forward. So always happy to chat more about it. And on to Yvonne.
So Meg, would you like your computer back? It's hard to get my web page. Aha, thank you. That was quite straightforward. Well, thank you, everyone. The other two talks are fascinating. And obviously, I think in terms of the projects involved, I've got much more in common with Meg. And when Meg was talking about activist or ethical publishing, I think actually this is where I fall in. in terms of this particular journal. I am not a mathematician, as anybody who knows me is aware. I like spreadsheets, but I'm not a mathematician. And the rationale behind this journal, which is a Diamond open access journal, started one day when and I'd had many conversations with Rupert, who's here, Stephen Eglin and Tim Gowers about the cost of scholarly publishing and how one could democratize access to scholarly information in a cost-effective manner. I have no problems, and I think I should say now, as a former publisher, with the fact that there's costs in the public publishing industry, but I do have problems with the obscene profit margins, and that's very much from where we were coming from. And so some areas, for example, some areas of mathematics are much more like the social sciences, because it's not like astrophysics or high energy physics. We've got huge collaborations where they can, internationally funded. Quite often we have scholars who are working on their own or in very small groups. And so one of the issues we had is that there's some areas of mathematics that were very poorly represented in terms of journal coverage. And so one day I was having a conversation with Tim when we were moaning about publishers, as we did at the time. And he said, I bet for the cost of an average APC, and this was an APC back in 2014, we could build a journal. And the university has a journal coordination scheme, which is responsible, and at the time was responsible for journal subscriptions. And open access was on the horizon, but we were at that point not paying for APCs. So we actually put in a bid, literally overnight. We wrote something. By 2 o'clock in the morning, it was ready, and we had a meeting the next day. And there was money in the system at that point, which is very different. It was also a small APC. It was 3,500. I mean, if you look at Springer Nature now, you think, well, bargain. So we put this bid in, and it was agreed that we could use £3,500 to launch a journal. And then we had to start thinking about how we actually did it. So firstly, it's in an area of mathematics that's growing rapidly, but doesn't have another competing journal. So it wasn't as if we were taking on an existing journal. We knew there was a niche there. Secondly, infrastructure. Most of mathematics, large degrees, large parts of physics, and most of astronomy put their work on the archive. There's a real culture of preprint sharing. And because of that, we thought that, we were lucky because we had infrastructure, because whereas, with Meg's journal, you don't have the infrastructure, we had the infrastructure. So it seemed the most cost-effective thing to do would be to have an overlay journal, and people could say, I've put this preprint on the archive and I'd like to submit it to your journal, which is exactly what we did. We also, for various reasons, wanted it to look very, very good, which I think, it does. We have a very good editorial board. So if I click there. So we have a couple of Fields medalists. I mean, in terms of mathematics, it's as good as it gets, really. I think I can say that. So as we were doing it, it's now hosted on the Scholastica platform. To begin with, we really wanted to keep the costs down because we had £3,500 play with. And so we were looking at using a French EpiSciences server, which the idea was it was being built so that people could publish on it. And that just wasn't happening. So in the end, we actually had to bite the bullet and pay for something. So we pay for Scholastica currently as our publishing platform. And then all of a sudden you realize you're paying not just for those articles that are published, but you're paying for every submission to the journal. I mean, the mad ones get, like with anything, you strip them out, but anything that has to be recommended or actually has to go through a peer review process, we get charged for that. Tim made the decision to go with established peer review, sort of double-blind peer review, and the peer review discussions can happen on the platform. I was all going, no, we should be doing open peer review. And it was like, no, not a massive one, go away. So that's not fine. So once an article has been posted on archive, the author only needs to inform the editorial board for it to be considered for publication. The model is fully open access, and the authors retain copyright over their articles, and it's CC by. And if you go into any particular article, so if just going to this one, actually, there's an editorial introduction that's written by whoever's peer reviewing, somebody who's peer reviewed it, and then you can go and you can read it at archive. So if people who don't know, this is what archive looks like. So you can see that actually as a user interface, it's really, really friendly. So when we were putting it together, I was drawn into it, because of my stance on publishing, but also because I've been a former publisher. But I've never been a journal publisher. I've been an ebooks and reference publisher, but there we go. So Tim at the time was very, very critical of Elsevier and had started the cost of knowledge boycott. So we knew that anything we did, people would be looking at and really examining to make sure it didn't go badly wrong so that people could go. So we wanted to do it properly. So we chose the platform. We made sure we were licensed in the Directory of Open Access Journals. We became members of OSPA, the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association. All our articles have DOIs, so that going forward, if the platform goes down, there's obviously, if something happens, you'll still be able to resolve to the actual articles. So we pay to Crossref for that. We've also used clocks, which is, I think, copies. Locks is lots of copies keep stuff safe. Clocks is something very similar. So basically you pay a couple of $100 a year. So everything is archived. So if it goes offline, we have a backup copy, basically. And we also do various things like we index the journal for discovery services such as MathSciNet. So we do a data feed to them, and also to Zentralblatt Mathematics, which has been the bane of my life. They wanted something very, very particular using JATS, which is technical language, which we couldn't really do. And in the end, they said, okay, go away, we'll do it for you. And we just thought, okay, fine, that's great. So it's worked really quite well. We've run into similar problems with Meg to some degree. So for example, one of the issues we've had is we wanted to be indexed in Scopus. That was fine. Elsevier, despite all of the rhetoric coming from myself and Tim about Elsevier at the time, even though I was a former Elsevier employee, they were fine. It was indexed immediately. Web of Science were an absolute nightmare. So we are now in the emerging citation index, and I'm actually going to take it up with them, because I think they say they track the journal for 2 years before they'll actually put you into Web of Science itself. And if you're on Web of Science, you can get an impact factor. Now, of course, we're both fundamentally opposed to impact factors. But what we've had is feedback, especially from potential authors from Chinese universities, that they've been told they can only submit to journals with impact factors. So it's catch-22. So we want to be able to, that we have ethical objections, but equally, we want to be able to enable people to publish. So it's really, quite interesting. So we wanted to do it to prove that Cambridge could take the lead in this. And we put together basically a toolkit. And Tim has been involved in another open access journal that more or less has followed exactly the same method. And there've been others that have come along, like the Open Journal of Astrophysics, for example, which has a very, very similar sort of interface to us. And it's, again, an overlay journal on the archive. I have some sort of longer term concerns. We managed to get another £1,500 out of the journal coordination scheme, and then things changed, journal prices, APCs, all of a sudden we didn't have money. Somebody philanthropically gave us some money, which is very good. So it's kept us going. And I think we're fine for I think our costs are probably about £2,500 a year, so more than Meg's, but we do all this extra. Nobody is paid. So Tim and the editors obviously give up their time. Tim does lots of the editorial introductions. My role is I sort of put it together and I do technical stuff in the background, which is where my involvement is. I think it's a great model. I have some issues about sustainability of Diamond open access journals. As I think, so if it's a small scholar-led publication, it's fine. But if I'm hit by a bus tomorrow, we know there's a problem. And I have, as publisher, been in a situation where somebody was not quite hit by a bus, but all of a sudden you lose a huge amount of knowledge really, really quickly. So sustainability is definitely an issue. But as a model that, does what it says in the tin, you are allowing access to very high quality, publicly funded research, and you can go through and you can just see, cost effectively, and it's free to publish in, free to access, but we do need to work out a sustainable funding model. And thank you. So if anybody would like to start off questions, and please use the roving mic because we have people watching from outside. So I think it's close as well. Yeah. Anybody?
Thank you very much. I think that's the answer we can give to when we say, oh, how can we get out of all those things, impact factors, publisher? This is the answer. This is people doing that, and I think it's great. And coming from a field that is also like a bit new, or where there is this reflection of, oh, we need a journal. Let's go open access. How do you convince a researcher to go that way? Because well, we started, we thought about that, and then someone comes and say, oh, we have a contract with Springer, we'll have a journal with them, and then everybody say, and when they choose where to publish, they will, but there are the people with Springer there, and everybody submits their paper there. So how do we convince a community to go that way? Do you have ideas or whatever?
It's a good question.
So,
just personal experience and in talking to some other folks that it takes a little while to get that traction going. And actually, Joe talked about, it's about relations that makes the infrastructure kind of go. And so that's at the heart of the infrastructure of this, are the people. And so that labor of love, I didn't mean it flippantly, like in some ways that's sort of like the initial impetus. And there's another concept from sociology about identity wages. So that your involvement kind of helps you with your own sort of personal identity as a scholar, and that may help propel forward sort of the early days of the journal too. But unless there's a way to catch that with some infrastructural support pretty quickly, you're going to probably be relying on the labor of early career researchers, you know, people who are themselves, you know, in precarious positions. So I agree, it can definitely be shaky at the beginning. So keeping that momentum going until you become more established, and then can find a little bit more of a sustainable model for is important. And so, but I know that a lot of universities are looking at publishing initiatives for scholars. So hopefully we'll see more and more of those.
I mean, I don't have a specific, but just one thing I would say is that obviously, you know, individual publishers can do things, they can establish reputation and so on. But I suppose, you know, and I am an individual publisher as well as being involved in the Open Book Collective, but I think it is, I mean, I would hope that we have a sort of broader reconfiguration of the, you know, of the publishing scene, I suppose, where open access, Diamond Open Access is something that is, there are funding structures that do make it more sustainable. It means you can pay the people that you need to pay, and that, you know, you do have a backup if you get hit by a bus. And I think, and so that would also, I think, be really important. It's a way of saying it's not just down to the publisher. We need to sort of rethink these things more broadly.
Can I just say, I think I'd agree with that. I think one of the issues is that we have become so institutionalized by journal publishing and impact factors, and actually the purpose, definitely with academic publishing, well, academic journal publishing, I think books are very different, is to try and get research disseminated as cost effectively as possible, and with as few barriers as possible. So you would just like to hope that it builds up momentum. And I mean, in our case, in terms of people actually, you know, submitting, it's been very much the fact that we have a stellar editorial board that was enough for people to think that this is better than most of the other journals that are out there. And there's somebody behind you as well. There's a gentleman behind you as well. No, it's fine. And then,
okay. So I'm 100% behind Diamond Open Access, and I think it or some equivalent is essentially how we have to go. But I do think we need to be very clear-eyed about costs and about sustainability, and all those people being properly being remunerated for their time. Because we already have a problem in academia with not being clear what exactly you are and aren't expected to do for your salary, and a lot of these kind of jobs or these kind of tasks end up falling on people, particularly early career researchers, you know, who to do things in the sort of hope that they'll help with their career in the future. And so given that archive and bioarchive and other preprint servers mostly are already funded, and there is a sort of an established system for that, have you had discussions? It seems to me that Diamond Open Access overlay journals in particular should be part of that ecosystem. Have you had discussions with funders about explicitly about putting these things on a permanent basis along those lines?
Not as yet, but I think that's coming. There was a JISC study done in, I think it was 2012. There was an overlay journal for astronomy called Ryoka, where they did look at how they could build a sustainable model. And then they did it for 3 years and then it fizzled out. And it's a real shame, but I think that's something we really do have to do, because it's actually, you know, because it sits on top of archive, it adds to the value of archive. And of course, UK institute, well, all higher education institutions, you know, are in archive subject areas, that may be specific, do contribute to archive. So it is possibly something that we should be talking about, and it adds value to archive.
Yeah, it's a super, super interesting model. For researchers in the social sciences, there isn't as much of a tradition of putting things on preprint servers as much. So it's just you'd have to aggregate from many more different places. So that would increase the challenges, definitely. So that's just something to think about. Although there is something called Social Archive now. Yeah. It just hasn't, I don't think it has quite the same momentum yet as archive.
Was it bought by Elsevier? What's the one that was bought by Elsevier?
Social Science Research.
Oh, that's right, yes. I was just getting,
yeah, which was a preprint.
That was the original preprint.
Yeah.
I'm Richard Fisher from Wolfson. Joe, thanks for that. I thought it was terrific. And thanks also for all the COPIB work on this stuff, which I think has also been fab and really thorough and interesting and much appreciated. Can I just say something slightly unhelpful, though, about libraries and monographs, which is that libraries never were central to the monographic proposition in the old days. They were important, but they were not determinant. And I'm slightly worried that some of the models we're building now assume they are determinant rather than important. And of course, if you look at the American stats, where famously less than 50% of American UP monograph sales have ever gone through libraries, you do have this challenge there. We have to think through it. If any of you saw The Kitchen yesterday, really interesting piece from California about the fate of Luminos, making that point. And I do think there is what I'm saying is it shouldn't all be loaded onto libraries, if you were to mean, to sort this out in terms of the finances of this going forward. And I think there is a danger that we're over obsessing about one particular constituency within this overall model. And we do need some other models which reflect that other reality of the other 50% of the world, if you see what I mean, which was never part of that in the old days. I suppose, can I make a quick second point? It's always worth remembering that there was always a strong Marxist critique of OA in its early days, partly because of the emphasis on unpaid and free labour. And that still goes on. And one of the reasons I'm not a big Diamond fan, and never have been, is because of this obsession with unpaid free labour, which strikes me as fundamentally wrong. So I'd just like to say that. And I think many people in the humanities have also been, one of the reasons why they haven't taken off is quite often you hear these arguments made, that it just fetishizes that yet again. So there is an alternative view on this stuff.
There's back as well, and you want to answer?
Oh yeah, so thank you so much for that. Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point. Obviously, we have sort of been presented with sort of duality, right? So on the one hand, the kind of Diamond model is substantially dependent on volunteer labour, and on the other hand, the BPC or APC model, where the labour is paid for, but we don't like BPCs. So, I would argue that we have to think about a model that, people are paid fairly for their labour, but that is sustainable. And I think that, in relation to putting all the responsibility for that on libraries, I would completely agree that's not a sustainable model either. So I had that sort of moment in my presentation where I said, well, I think, there's a bureaucratic challenge for, let's say, the expansion of a membership-based model. There's also a financial challenge. If all publishers started running membership programs, then the open access budgets of libraries would very quickly become overwhelmed as well. So there is a kind of shorter and a medium term kind of, perspective. We need to think about perhaps, in the short term, I think this is a model that has potential to grow, but in the medium to longer term, it will require reconfigurations, within library budgets, perhaps within how funders support publishing, and also amongst, not absolving open access publishers themselves from responsibility. I mean, we have Rupert from the open book publishers here in the room, highly successful in a mixed model. for some revenue from membership program, but some from the book sales and other things. And I think from what Rupert is often saying to publishers, you know, we need to learn how to do this. And part of that work is then sharing resources. You know, so we're borrowing from open book publishers, you know, a white label website framework for our publisher. You've obviously done some of the sharing expertise, sharing knowledge. I really like the mentoring thing in the previous panel. That needs to happen as well. So yeah, funders, libraries, and publishers themselves.
We probably have time for about another 3 questions. We're running slightly late, but we started slightly late. But then again, if people want to stay, it's fine.
Hi, thanks. Thank you all for really enlightening information and talks, and for all the work that you're doing. That's super important. I wanted to sort of ask about something that Meg briefly mentioned in her talk, but it's sort of a question for everyone about the possibility for crowdfunding. Obviously, with thinking about it for the past 20 minutes, I can already think of some potential inequity issues that might be associated with that. But on the other hand, if we look towards journalism, for example, we're sort of seeing that a lot of these sort of independent news desks are increasingly being funded by things like Patreon or similar, where sort of people pay, consumers pay what they can. And similarly connected, it would be I look at something like the PMC in the United States, which purchases thousands of articles a year to make them open access, and then sort of just publishes them on PubMed. And I see that as sort of kind of a patron model of sorts. And I just sort of wanted to know what your thoughts are on that as people who are on the other side.
That's a really great question. We've certainly at the Journal of Information Literacy, we've talked a lot about alternate funding streams, and things like advertising always felt kind of distasteful, didn't want to have to go there. Crowdsourcing, my immediate feeling is, well, that's sort of like setting up a lemonade stand, and why should we have to, but at the same time, yes, there's the idea of asking people to sort of think, what's it worth to you, and can you offer a little bit, but there's no obligation to, is not, doesn't sound wholly sort of wrong, although there's obviously some infrastructural issues, and not everybody's got access to the ability to use something like Patreon or something like that. So yes, we haven't really gone down that road. It just seems to us, those sort of things like it just seems sort of too bitty. We would just almost wanted it to just be, want to know solidly where the funding was coming from and leave it at that. But times are changing as well. And an awful lot of the world gets funded this way. So why not decentralize it a little bit and pool resources together? So it's definitely food for thought that I'm going to go back and think about things.
I think in the area of my journal, not my area, obviously, I think it wouldn't work just because it's a very, very small. And I think it's a really interesting question, but I think it could continue to spread inequality because only those who could afford to would feel that they had a right. And I'd be a bit queasy about that.
I'll just say one quick word on that. So, I mean, both what we're doing is, in a way, a form of crowdfunding, but the crowd is not the consumer, but the library or the institution. So I suppose that would be a consortial funding model. It's sort of, similar. It's a similar logic. I don't know what it's going to be. I remember what it is. Yeah.
I just think Patreon is a problem.
That's what I was going to say. What I was going to say was, well, that's the second point. Is that so in books we've had knowledge unlatched. I'm sorry, knowledge unlatched, but so which is again a sort of form of crowdfunding in some ways. So if we are going to do that kind of model, then the question is, how is that done, and what are the platforms that through which that crowdfunding is happening?
Hi, thanks for that really interesting talk. This is, I think, primarily for Meg and Yvonne. So I work at Cambridge University Press, and I manage our sort of publishing ethics and research integrity team. And I noticed in both your talks that wasn't kind of one of the activities that was mentioned. So in other words, if there was an issue with an article, if there was a sort of allegation of plagiarism or something like that, or even like a legal allegation, how is that kind of managed with your journals? And I guess maybe thinking more of the legal side, if there were to be a sort of legal issue, would that not sort of entirely wipe out the budget that you have? And sort of what backing do you have to kind of support the journal in those issues?
That's a great question, and one that we'd actually recently sort of worked through in our move to Edinburgh Diamond. So before we decided to make the move, we had various policies in place regarding ethics and integrity. So regarding plagiarism, for example, and integrity in our peer review process. And we signed on to various sort of international standards in those areas as well. Regarding takedown challenges, we would be partnering then with the larger organization, the parent organization that we're part of, and they would help us with the legal. So we would have representatives from ourselves, the Information Literacy Group, and CILIP, and all of those folks would be involved in making the decision whether to take down, and then CILIP would be assisting with the legal process if it came to that. Yeah.
So apart from the legal side, there's also sort of coordinating with potentially multiple institutions on like investigations into sort of research misconduct. So would that again be something that CILIP would do, or is that something that the volunteers working on the journal would coordinate, or how would that work?
Up to we've never had it, so I don't really know exactly how it would work in practice. It's an absolutely excellent question, and like I said, it's part of the stuff that we're getting our ducks in a row about in our move to Edinburgh Diamond. But that's the nature of the initial discussions that we've had. Just
we've had, I believe, cases where people, because it's a very, very small area. I mean, it's just Greek mathematics, but it's a very small Greek area. We are aware that people have submitted things that may have been seen elsewhere, put it that way. But because it's such a small area, it's really easy to pick up on that. So we haven't been faced with that problem, and it's highly unlikely that we will be. If it was a journal on a completely different subject area, yes, absolutely. But I think with this, and because the editorial team is so skilled and they are the world experts, I mean, we're lucky in that respect. So they're able to pick it up. And also, because we're relying on archive as well, quite often on archive, you do see cases of plagiarism. And because our archive, although it's not peer reviewed, people comment. So that is actually done at the community level. So if somebody submitted something, it would be very, very clear at that level. Sorry. And one more question. I think Lizzie has a question, and one at the back, and then I think or lunch will be getting cold. But
so thinking about the problem around using volunteer labour, do you think it would work in an ideal world? Obviously this would be a big kind of change, but to try and get volunteering with Diamond journals into people's role descriptions as academics, or do you think it needs to be paid positions on editorial boards and things?
Personally, I don't. So everything we've done has been in our own time. So all the time I give to it. So I was doing stuff last night, that's studying my own time. But that's because I'm bloody minded and I want to prove the principle. I appreciate that it's not a sustainable model. I think because academics are so used to peer reviewing as part of their unpaid workload, and I can say this with a UCU hat on as well, there's a huge expectation on academics to do things for the good of the community. So I think in terms of academics doing that sort of work, yes. I think it would not, it's no more unreasonable to be involved in a Diamond Open Access journal than it is to be involved in an editorial board of any other journal. It's just you won't get paid for it, but that workload people won't have an issue with. I think in doing the technical stuff in the background and the rest of it, that is something we could potentially pay. But then when we had some money, we thought, well, we could pay for this. We thought, so how do we pay them? And we've since come up with an option of how we could pay them to make it more sustainable. But also, I think it's a really interesting thing to be involved in terms of, just seeing the fact that you're getting people coming and using something that's there for free and is actually providing really good quality information, which would probably not have got out there just because the coverage wasn't there. I think in itself, that's a really good incentive. Where I do have concerns, and it's related to that, is to do with Clarivet, and so Web of Science, and the way that they orchestrate what they decide is quality in an academic publishing. I have real problems with that, and I'm becoming more and more annoyed about that. I'm like a cross face now.
Also, just briefly like to interject also that the folks at Edinburgh Diamond are all paid.
Yeah.
So they're running the infrastructure, and they're providing a whole host of services and support for the journal, and they're all paid through the University of Edinburgh. So those are 100% properly paid positions, and are not in that sort of precarious contingent sort of. So again, so the labor then that will be involved once we switch to this is the as Yvonne says, sort of is not great, but it's sort of that standard stuff of being an academic. However, it would be lovely if that standard stuff was better incentivized and really became part of packages for promotion and tenure, and we're seen and viewed on, extremely highly. So.
Just quickly, I just want to ask Meg a very quick question. So are you paying Edinburgh?
Yes, so we will be paying about £1,500 to Edinburgh per year. So it's not, so we're able to fund it through the professional organization. They're not a lot in the scheme of things. Right. So again, it's not that much more of a budget than what we currently have been working on. So.
And I think the final question was at the back.
So it's all incredibly laudable, and obviously there's some concerns about kind of, payment for labor and all that sort of stuff. This is a bit of a left field question, but I hope you'll bear with me, because obviously you're all thinking about how to produce equitable relations. I suppose my question is, could you speak about the intersection between language and open access, and how, I suppose I'm concerned that the risk, obviously we're an Anglophone conference here, but I was wondering is there a risk of kind of recapitulating hegemonic relations of power on an international stage, really? So that's my kind of concern. Is there a way that we can actually move forward in regards to that issue?
No, provide one response to that. So yeah, no, that's something that we've talked quite a lot about on our project, and I think it's a challenge within academia, broadly speaking, that there is a dominance of Anglophone content within the academic landscape. It's something, that we committed to bibliodiversity, thinking about supporting scholarship from different publishers, but also different countries, different languages, and so on. But a model where you're going to libraries asking for funding, I think does pose a challenge if it ends up being that libraries are probably going to support the text in the languages that their students and researchers are most interested in. So of course that does mean potentially diversifying kind of libraries that you're speaking to, which I think is obviously something that we will be doing. I mean, there have been German consortium funding models been quite successful, for example, getting funding for German scholarship, and I think we hope to be doing that kind of work. But of course, it does depend then on the particular national context in which that language is spoken, whether that's happens to be a national context, whether there are funds available for this kind of thing, and funds not. So yeah, it's one that we're very much thinking about. We're currently applying for a follow-on project where that question is one that is really at its heart. How do we support bibliodiversity more broadly? How can we do that, and how we, let's say, allocate funds? At the moment, the funding model is just, the money goes from library to publisher on a flat basis. Do we need to redistribute the way that funds go to lift up publishers that because you're effectively creating a market that the market doesn't support as much, or whether that be an infrastructure provider? But these are questions that are live for us, but not answered yet.
No, it's fine.
Just on this note, I work for the Latin American and Iberian collections at the University Library, and we have been contacted by a consortium of a Latin American vendor working together with the greatest social science publisher in Latin America, which is Claxo. They offer all of their publications open access. But they were using this model, and so they were getting support. They were asking for support for libraries. They got a lot of support in the US. We could not even start the conversation here in Cambridge. And so there are other ways through which we are getting these publications. But I see challenges in this, and I would like this to be addressed somehow, sometime.
I think I would say, because what I work on is mathematical in terms of there's the language of maths, basically. So actually we have a very diverse sort of input. yes, obviously the language describing the equations is in English, but actually in mathematics itself is. So that's a bit of a cop out, isn't it? It's a very good cop out. I think we are literally running out of time because we have overrun. So unless Meg has anything.
No, I mean, summed it up.
Well, thank you both to Meg and Joe and our panel, and thank you for being such a nice audience. One round.